Man saves lion cub from barbed wire. What the lioness did next will leave you speechless. The African savanna shimmered under a relentless midday sun, a sprawling tapestry of golden grass swaying in the dry wind, dotted with twisted acacia trees clawing at the sky. The air was thick with heat and dust, buzzing with the faint hum of insects and the occasional cry of a circling vulture. It was a land of raw beauty and ruthless survival, where life teetered on a knife's edge every day. Jack Grayson wasn't just another visitor to this wild expanse. A weathered wildlife photographer and conservationist in his late 30s, he'd spent nearly a decade chasing the untamed spirit of Africa through his lens. With his sun-bleached hair, a scar snaking down his forearm from a past encounter with a rogue buffalo, and eyes that held both wonder and weariness. Jack was no stranger to the savannah's dual nature, its breathtaking splendor and its brutal indifference. He'd captured cheetahs mid-sprint, elephants bathing in muddy rivers, and lions tearing into prey under blood-red sunsets. But nothing in his years of experience could have prepared him for the heart-stopping moment that loomed just beyond the next rise. Jack rattled along a barely-there trail in his battered jeep, the engine crawling as it kicked up clouds of red dust. His camera rested on the passenger seat, its lens cap off, ready for action. The day had been quiet, too quiet, he thought, when a sound pierced the stillness like a shard of glass. It was faint at first, a high-pitched whimper that tugged at something primal in him. He slammed on the brakes, the jeep lurching to a stop, and tilted his head to listen. There it was again, a desperate, keening cry, raw with pain and fear. Jack's pulse quickened. He knew that sound. He'd heard it once before, years ago, when he'd stumbled across a dying zebra foal abandoned by its herd. But this was different. This was the unmistakable wail of a lion cub in distress. Adrenaline surged through him as he grabbed his binoculars and scanned the horizon. Nothing but grass and heat haze. The cry came again, louder now, pulling him like a magnet. Without a second thought, he turned the jeep off the path and plunged into the sea of grass, the vehicle bouncing over hidden rocks and termite mounds. His mind raced with possibilities: hyenas, a snake bite, poachers, but he pushed them aside. Whatever it was, he had to find that cub before it was too late. After several agonizing minutes, he spotted it. A tiny golden shape thrashing weakly in a patch of trampled grass. Jack killed the engine and leapt out, his boots crunching on the dry earth. As he drew closer, his stomach twisted. A lion cub, no more than a few months old, was ensnared in a vicious coil of barbed wire. The rusty metal had bitten deep into its tender flesh, staining its tawny fur with streaks of crimson. The cub's amber eyes, wide with terror, locked onto Jack's as it let out another pitiful cry, its small body trembling with exhaustion. Jack cursed under his breath. Barbed wire wasn't natural here. It was a remnant of human greed, likely left by poachers or careless ranchers encroaching on the wild. He'd seen its toll before: mangled hooves, severed wings, life snuffed out in slow agony. But this cub was still alive, still fighting. He couldn't let it die. He sprinted back to the jeep, yanking open his rucksack to retrieve a pair of heavy-duty wire cutters and a first aid kit. Every second counted. Hyenas could already be sniffing the blood on the wind. And where there was a cub, there was a pride, and a mother who wouldn't take kindly to a stranger near her offspring. Kneeling beside the cub, Jack moved with the precision of a surgeon and the gentleness of a father. The little lion snarled weakly, baring its milk teeth, but its strength was fading fast. "Easy, little warrior," Jack whispered, his voice low and soothing. "I'm not here to hurt you." The cub's eyes flickered with confusion, but it stilled as Jack's hands hovered over the wire. The barbs had wrapped around its hind leg and torso, digging deeper with every thrash. Blood oozed from the wounds, attracting a swarm of flies that buzzed incessantly. Jack gritted his teeth and began snipping, each cut releasing a metallic twang that echoed in the stillness. The cub whimpered, but didn't fight him. Perhaps it sensed his intent, or perhaps it was simply too weak to resist. Minutes stretched into eternity as he worked, sweat beading on his forehead and dripping into his eyes. He freed the leg first, then tackled the wire around the cub's chest, careful not to nick its skin further. Finally, with a triumphant snap, the last strand fell away. The cub collapsed onto the grass, panting heavily, its sides heaving like bellows. Jack's head snapped up, and his blood turned to ice. Standing mere yards away, framed by the swaying grass, was a lioness in her prime. Her sinewy frame rippled with power, her golden coat gleaming in the sunlight. Her eyes, piercing, unblinking, and blazed with maternal rage, bored into him like twin suns. Her lips curled back, revealing fangs that could crush bone with ease. Jack's mind screamed at him to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. He knew the stories: lionesses who torn apart hyenas, leopards, even men, to protect their young. He'd just trespassed into her world, holding her cub in his hands. The jeep was too far to reach, and his rifle, useless against the charging lion, was stowed under the seat. He was defenseless. The lioness took a step forward, her growl deepening into a snarl that vibrated through the ground. Jack's heart hammered so hard he thought it might burst. "I'm not your enemy," he said aloud, though he doubted she'd understand. He raised his hands slowly, palms out, a universal gesture of peace or surrender. Then, in a flash of inspiration, he stepped aside, exposing the cub nestled in the jeep. "He's yours," Jack said, his voice steady despite the terror clawing at his throat. "I only wanted to help." A heart-stopping standoff. The lioness paused, her ears twitching as she sniffed the air. Her gaze flicked to the cub, then back to Jack, assessing him. The cub let out a feeble mew, its tiny paws reaching toward her, and something shifted in her demeanor. The snarl faded, replaced by a softer rumbling sound. Not quite a purr, but not a threat either. She approached the jeep with deliberate steps, her massive paws silent on the earth. Jack held his ground, every muscle tensed, ready to bolt if she lunged. She stopped inches from him, close enough that he could feel the heat radiating from her body and smell the musky scent of her fur. Her eyes met his, and for a fleeting moment he saw not just a predator, but a mother, fierce, protective, and uncertain. The cub wriggled free of the blanket and tumbled toward her. The lioness lowered her head, nuzzling it gently, licking its wounds with a tenderness that belied her strength. Jack watched, barely breathing, as she inspected her baby, ensuring it was whole. The moment that defied nature, then came the twist that would haunt Jack for years. The lioness lifted her head and fixed him with a stare that felt almost human. Her amber eyes softened, and from her throat came a deep resonant burr, a sound he'd never heard from a lion in the wild. It wasn't fear or submission, but something else entirely: gratitude. Jack's knees nearly buckled. He'd expected claws and teeth, not this. The lioness stepped back, nudging her cub toward the grass. But before she disappeared into the savannah, she turned and gave him one final look. It was a look that said, "I see you. I know what you did." Then with a flick of her tail, she was gone, her cub scampering after her. Jack sank to the ground, his legs trembling as the adrenaline drained away. He laughed, a shaky, disbelieving sound, and ran a hand through his sweat-soaked hair. He just stared death in the face and walked away with a story no one would believe. Echoes of the encounter that night, around a crackling campfire, Jack recounted the tale to his fellow conservationists. The grizzled ranger, Mwangi, nodded knowingly. "Lions are smarter than people think," he said, puffing on a pipe. "She knew you weren't a threat. You gave her back her future." In the weeks that followed, Jack threw himself into his work with renewed purpose, but the memory of the lioness lingered like a shadow. He'd spot her sometimes, from a safe distance, patrolling with her cub, now growing stronger, its wounds healed. Each time, she'd pause and glance his way, her gaze steady and calm, as if acknowledging their unspoken pact. A legacy of trustword of Jack's encounter spread beyond the savannah, whispered among rangers, shared in dusty bars, and eventually written into articles that reached the outside world. It became more than a story. It became a symbol. In a land scarred by poaching, drought, and human encroachment, it was proof that bridges could be built, even between the wild and the tame. On his final day in the savannah, Jack stood atop a hill, watching the sun sink below the horizon in a blaze of orange and purple. He thought of the lioness and her cub, now thriving somewhere out there, and felt a quiet pride. He hadn't just saved a life. He touched something deeper, a thread of understanding that ran through all living things. As he climbed into his jeep and drove away, the wind carried the distant roar of a lion. Jack smiled. Sometimes he realized the bravest act isn't fighting the king of the jungle. It's trusting it to see the good in you.